In the valley where the sun took its time to rise and the mist clung to the trees like memories too old to name, there was a village called Elora. Not many maps bore its name, and the ones that did placed it like an afterthought, curled between forest and river, as if even the land hesitated to claim it. The people of Elora rose early, worshipped the seasons, and believed more in what was hidden than what was shown. They feared the wind when it whispered low and the owls when they hooted twice in a row. The women covered mirrors at night, and the men never whistled past dusk. Everything in Elora was heavy with meaning, even silence. Among the woven huts and fire-warmed nights lived a girl named Nyasha. She was born under a moonless sky, when the river ran backward for a moment, and the midwives whispered prayers even as they caught her in their arms. She didn't cry at birth. She stared, wide-eyed and ancient, as if remembering something instead of beginning. Her skin, dark like the wet earth after a storm, bore faint lines across her shoulders and back, delicate swirls that seemed etched rather than formed. The village elders said they were just markings from the womb, nature's rough handiwork. But her mother, Dahlia, knew better. She had seen these before, carved onto clay pots her grandmother once refused to explain, burned into the bark of trees near forgotten shrines. But Dahlia said nothing. Not to the elders. Not to the healers. She held her daughter close and hummed lullabies with no words. Nyasha grew like a whisper among loud things. She was not loud herself, nor did she seek to be. But somehow she was always noticed. As a child she would stand in the rain and not get soaked. The other children laughed at first, then stared. Her hair soaked, yes, but her face remained dry and her skin never chilled. Flowers bent slightly when she walked past them, as if bowing or begging for her attention. When she touched sick birds or wounded goats, they quieted. Sometimes they healed. Sometimes they simply died in peace, eyes closing like they'd seen her before. By the time she was 12, the men in the village had stopped looking her in the eye. Not out of respect but fear wrapped in caution. Her eyes were too still, her silence too loud. And she was beautiful, not in the way songs were sung, but in the way rivers ran deep and slow, carrying stories instead of words. Her beauty was the kind that made people uncomfortable, made them search for reason or a curse. Something unnatural. Something to blame. Elora did not know what to do with what it could not name. Dahlia, meanwhile, remained her daughter's quiet shield. She brewed herbs, healed fevers, birthed children, and buried stillborns. People came to her when desperate but never stayed too long. They would speak to her without touching, thank her without smiling. There were whispers that her remedies worked too well, that maybe she asked spirits for help. When a child with a crooked foot walked straight after Dahlia's poultice, the mother wept and then moved away 2 weeks later. Gratitude and fear often rode the same horse in Elora. Nyasha watched and learned. She learned not to laugh too loud. Not to answer questions too quickly. She learned to avoid mirrors, not because she feared what she saw but because others feared what they might. Once when she was 9, a boy followed her into the woods. He was 2 years older, son of a hunter, with the arrogance of someone never told no. He pushed her against a tree and tried to scare her, tried to touch her. She didn't scream. She just looked at him. He stumbled back, eyes wide, as if something old had spoken in her silence. He ran home with mud on his knees and tears on his cheeks. He never looked at her again. The villagers didn't speak of that day, but they changed after it. Mothers pulled their sons inside earlier. Men began avoiding paths that led past her home. And the girls? They watched her with something between envy and dread, like she held a beauty that demanded a price no one wanted to pay. Nyasha did not ask for any of it. She wanted what the other girls had: companions, careless laughter, arms to link, songs to sing. But when she tried, something always cracked. A jug would break on its own. A shadow would stretch too far. A baby would cry at her approach. So she kept her distance. Not bitter, not angry, just aware. Aware that in Elora, difference was a warning and warnings were meant to be silenced. The elders of the village held gatherings once every season to speak of omens and balance. The sky, the harvest, the dreams of the goat herders. Everyone attended, including Nyasha and her mother, though they always stood near the edges. One such gathering, when Nyasha was 16, brought a heavy hush across the crowd. The river had flooded, fish floated dead on the surface, and a red moon had risen without warning. The elders were uneasy. The people were restless. They wanted a reason. They needed a cause. And when people need a cause, they often choose the quietest target. A woman named Ada, who had lost her baby a month before, claimed she'd seen Nyasha near the river the night of the red moon. Another swore they saw her shadow move differently than her body. Another claimed the markings on her back had started glowing, though no one had seen her without clothes in years. The accusations were flimsy, spun from grief and suspicion, but they were enough. Enough for the village to start weaving shame like a basket, one stick at a time. Dahlia tried to intervene. She brought herbs. She brought logic. But logic doesn't speak as loudly as fear. They told her she had let her daughter stray too far into the forest, that her bloodline might be touched by something ancient and unclean, that her silence was unnatural, and her eyes too deep for a child. Dahlia wept that night, the first time Nyasha had ever seen her mother cry. But she did not tell her daughter to hide. She told her to breathe. The earth knows, she said. And the earth remembers. That same week, Nyasha found an old man staring at her from across the market. He was hunched, mostly blind, chewing leaves with no teeth. When she passed, he murmured a single word under his breath, "Mark-bearer." No one else heard it. She did. She asked her mother that night what it meant, but Dahlia only shook her head. "Things too old to say out loud," she said. "Things that never fully die." There was a night when Nyasha sat alone near the edge of the forest. The moon was whole, white and silent, and the wind ran soft fingers through the trees. She pressed her hand into the soil. It crumbled around her fingers like it knew her touch. She closed her eyes and listened. There were whispers, not words, just impressions. Sorrow. Waiting. Depth. She didn't know why, but tears came. Not because she was sad. Because she was seen. In Elora, no one spoke of what lived beneath the land. Not anymore. The old ways were buried, both out of fear and shame. Stories of mud spirits, of keepers of the deep, of women who bore marks and called lightning. They had been told as children's tales and later burned in silence. But those stories, like seeds in forgotten soil, waited. And Nyasha, without knowing, without asking, was a sprout breaking the surface. The markings on her skin darkened slightly with age, not fading as the elders had promised. Some days they seemed to pulse. Once, when she stood near a fire, one line shimmered like wet ink. She covered them with cloth. But the village noticed anyway. Because Elora always noticed what it feared. She became the center of everything whispered and never spoken. They never accused her directly, never blamed her face to face. But animals slaughtered at night were said to scream louder when she passed. Crops failing? Maybe she crossed that field the week before. A cough that wouldn't go away? Perhaps her shadow brushed the child's crib. The logic was thin, but the fear was thick. And in Elora, thick fear clogged all reason. And yet, Nyasha stayed. She did not run. She did not fight. She moved like water, quiet, deep and patient. For she knew, somewhere inside her bones, that time is a drum and its rhythm returns. She knew somehow that she was not born wrong, but born ahead. And soon the past would catch up. But Elora did not want to catch up. Elora wanted stillness. Elora wanted sameness. And when the earth began to stir, when the marks began to gleam ever so slightly in the dawn, Elora began to plan. Not for healing, not for understanding, but for a ritual of shame. One they believed would silence the ancient blood in her and return the village to forgetful peace. They were wrong. The mud they would use to bury her would not cover her. It would awaken what the earth had long buried, and the silence they feared would speak louder than any scream. Bwana had never liked anything he couldn't understand, and he made sure the village knew it. He was the kind of man who scowled at rainbows and spat when birds sang too loudly. A man whose smile only ever stretched when someone else's fortunes fell. He'd carved his life out of fear. Fear he inspired in others, and fear he hid deep in his own chest like a moldy root. Power in his eyes was not earned but claimed, hoarded, and sharpened like a spear. He was not born rich, nor particularly clever. But what he lacked in wit, he made up for in cruelty masked as confidence. He had married early, to a woman who once laughed like a stream but now barely spoke above a whisper. Together they had one child, a daughter named Ebel, who was beautiful in a way carved from her father's ambition and her mother's quiet sorrow. Bwana raised her like a prize goat, clean, adorned, taught to walk in straight lines and say the right things. He told her what to wear, how to smile, and how to win the eyes of the village boys. She obeyed because it was easier than resisting. 4 years, Ebel was the village's gem, the girl everyone expected to marry well, speak sweetly, and shine in the way daughters of men like Bwana were meant to shine. But that light began to dim the moment Nyasha stepped into womanhood. Nyasha didn't try to compete. She didn't dress to impress. She didn't perform. She simply was. And somehow that was worse. Her presence made others feel small, not because she mocked them but because she didn't need them to define her. And the village, which had always looked to Bwana's family for direction, began to glance elsewhere, toward the girl with quiet power and strange grace. Bwana noticed the shift before anyone else. It came in the way the elders paused when Nyasha passed, in how even old men tilted their heads when she spoke. In the silence that followed her name, silence filled with things people feared to say. He saw his daughter's confidence falter. Her eyes lingered too long on the space Nyasha had just left. And that was enough. It started small. He told a joke during market, loud enough to be overheard, about children born during moonless nights. How they carried shadows in their lungs. How they brought luck that turned backward. People laughed. A few glanced toward Nyasha's home. That was enough for the first stone. The next week he spoke of spirits that wandered into wombs uninvited. Of women who bore daughters not quite human. Of old stories buried too long. He told these tales to the men who sharpened knives, to the women who carried water, to the children who repeated what they heard like parrots. He made fear sound like concern. "I worry," he'd say, eyes narrowed. "I worry she walks without footsteps. That's not right, is it?" Soon, Nyasha was no longer the girl with quiet beauty, she was the girl people whispered about before turning their backs. Mothers gripped their children's hands tighter when she passed. Her herbs at the market sat longer. The chickens outside her home began to disappear. And Bwana? He smiled more. His obsession bloomed like rot under sun. He began to follow her, never close, never directly, but always watching. He marked the places she went, the people she spoke to, the trees she paused near. He carved her name into wood and burned it, just to see if the smoke carried differently. When Ebel brought home a carved pendant Nyasha had once worn, Bwana snatched it and threw it into the fire. "You will not become like her," he growled. His daughter didn't ask why. Every strange thing became Nyasha's fault. A goat giving birth to a stillborn? Nyasha must have passed by the pen. A boy falling ill after swimming? Perhaps Nyasha had cursed the river. It didn't matter that she was nowhere near. What mattered was how easy it had become to believe. Bwana knew fear better than anyone. He fed it with sugar and called it truth. He began attending the elders' meetings more often. Sat closer, spoke louder. He'd never cared for omens before, but now he quoted them like scripture. "We must protect our own," he'd say. "The ancestors would not want us silent in the face of danger." And though the elders shifted uncomfortably, none of them contradicted him. Because Bwana did not just speak, he pressed. He stared. He made dissent feel unsafe. He even tried to speak to Dahlia once, meeting her at the edge of the forest. He pretended to want a remedy for sleeplessness, but she saw through him. "It's not me you're afraid of," she said, placing a packet of dried roots in his hand. "It's her spirit, because it won't bow to you." Bwana had left without a word, but that night he beat his dog for barking too long. Something about Dahlia's calm shook him more than he admitted. What made Bwana truly dangerous wasn't just his hatred, it was his hunger. He needed control the way others needed food. And Nyasha, with her untamed calm and ancient eyes, reminded him that power could exist without violence, without force. That scared him. Because if others saw it too, his world, the one he had built with threats and heavy silences, might crumble. He began to speak of solutions. Quietly at first, in corners and dark rooms. "What if we sent her away?" he'd ask. "For her safety, of course. And ours." A few nodded. Then more. He brought gifts to the elders. Goats, firewood, palm wine. He reminded them how peaceful Elora had been before strange things began to happen. He never said Nyasha's name, but everyone knew. Still, it wasn't enough. She remained. Unbroken. Unafraid. So Bwana grew bolder. He told a group of men he'd seen Nyasha speaking with trees. That the bark had moved. That her feet didn't leave prints in wet earth. "We can't wait for misfortune," he said, voice low but urgent. "We must act before the spirits turn against us all." He began carving symbols in secret, old protection runes twisted into curses. He left them near her home, buried in the soil. When a snake coiled near her doorstep one morning, villagers whispered that the earth itself had turned on her. Bwana smiled, though no one saw. His wife watched him change. Saw the fury beneath his silence, the way he clenched his fists when Ebel mentioned Nyasha's name. She once asked him why he hated the girl so much. He did not answer. Just stared at her until she looked away. But inside the truth boiled. He hated her because she reminded him of what he could never control. He hated her because his daughter no longer walked with pride, but with doubt. He hated her because every time he looked at her, he saw the stories of old, not as myth but as future. A future where men like him held no voice. He convinced himself that silencing her was not cruelty but duty. that the village needed cleansing, that his family's name would be restored only when Nyasha's was buried. He began to speak of purification, of rituals lost but not forgotten. He hinted at mud and shame, of covering what could not be understood. The old ways, he said, were not cruel. They were necessary. He began crafting a plan, not with swords but with words and fear. He would gather the right people. The ones who owed him, feared him, or simply needed a reason to hate. They would confront her, accuse her, and then they would cleanse her. With mud, with shame, with silence. He pictured it in his mind, her covered, voiceless, humiliated, reduced to something forgettable. And in that vision he found peace. Twisted, bitter peace. But what he did not know, what no whisper in Elora dared to tell him, was that the mud he would use did not belong to him. That it bore memory, language, and breath. That it was older than his hatred, deeper than his cruelty. That the symbols on her skin were not curses but keys. And when the mud touched her, it would not silence her. It would awaken what he feared most. The day began with the drums. They echoed across Elora like heartbeat thunder, calling the villagers from their homes to the sacred square beneath the ancient baobab. It was the kind of gathering reserved for only the most important of matters, ceremonies, judgments, or mourning. This time the air held all three. Nyasha woke to the sound, her breath steady despite what she knew was coming. 4 days, the signs had thickened like smoke, whispers cutting sharp through the market, doorways closing as she approached, and most of all, silence from those who once offered her warmth. Even her mother, who had warned her that fear often wears the face of righteousness, could only hold her hand now and say nothing. She dressed simply, no jewelry, no herbs in her belt, no defiance on her face. Only stillness. As she stepped out into the morning light, a bird shrieked overhead and then fell silent as if warned. Nyasha kept walking. The village center swelled with bodies, men with sharpened expressions, women with sorrow knotted into their shawls, and children who didn't know what they were about to learn. At the front stood the elders, grave and unreadable. And beside them, dressed in embroidered pride, stood Bwana. His voice rang first. Not with a shout, but with a slow, measured tone that gripped the crowd like a noose. "The time has come," he began, raising his arms like a prophet. "For too long we have ignored the signs. Crops that do not grow. Rivers that pull back their tongues. Children waking with fevers we cannot name. And in the center of it all, one girl." He didn't need to say her name. Eyes turned. Faces shifted. And Nyasha, who had not moved, lifted her chin just slightly. "She walks untouched by hardship," Bwana continued, now circling her as if she were prey. "She speaks to things we do not see. Our chickens die. Our skies dry. And the spirits grow restless." Someone coughed in the crowd. Another murmured, "It's true. Fear moves like water. Once spilled, it seeps into every crack." One elder raised his voice, hesitant. "Bwana, these are heavy claims. Where is the proof?" Bwana spun, his voice growing hot. "Proof? Do we wait for the forest to eat our children? Do we wait until our blood dries in our own veins? This is not accusation, it is protection." He pointed a thick, trembling finger at Nyasha. She was marked at birth. Hidden by her mother. You all remember, the stains. You said they were nothing. But now we see. Nyasha stood calm. "If I brought drought, why are your wells still wet?" she asked softly. "If I am cursed, why have none who touched me fallen?" Her voice did not rise, but it stilled the space around her. A bird called in the distance. Leaves rustled. The world listened. Bwana's face darkened. Words. Clever words from a clever tongue. But curses don't always strike the speaker first. Sometimes they wait. Sometimes they whisper. He turned to the elders, then to the crowd. "We must cleanse her. Not with death, no. Let us not become beasts. But with shame. With truth. Let the spirits know we reject her darkness." There was silence. Then a muttered agreement. Then another. And finally, a wave of reluctant nods, like dry grass bowing to wind. The elders did not speak. Their silence was permission. Bwana stepped forward. "Remove her garments." There was a pause. A deep, sickened hush. Then 2 women, older, ashamed, approached. They avoided Nyasha's eyes, their hands trembling as they pulled at her robe. She did not fight. She did not cry. Her skin glowed in the sun like polished wood, unhidden and unashamed. She stood taller in her nakedness than any of them did clothed. Next came the mud. Carried in wide calabashes, thick and black like riverbed secrets. It had been dug from the old northern marsh, where the soil clung to skin like it remembered something. No one used that mud anymore, not for bricks, not for fields. But Bwana had chosen it for a reason. It was sticky. Stained. It humiliated. He took the first scoop himself and flung it against her chest. It slapped wetly, dripping down her body. Another handful came, then another. Soon others joined in, uncertain but obedient. They smeared it across her back, her face, her legs, until her brown skin became dark and glistening, as if night itself had tried to consume her. And then the murmurs began. At first it was confusion. Gasp. Someone dropped their bowl. The mud was changing. It wasn't running down her the way it should. It clung to her in lines, sharp, deliberate, curling around her arms and spine like ink. Symbols. Not drawn by hands but shaped by intention. Circles inside triangles. Arrows with feathered ends. Marks older than anyone present could name. They pulsed faintly as if aware of their watchers. Bwana stepped back. "What trick is this?" he spat. Nyasha said nothing. A child in the front row whispered, "She's glowing." And it was true. The symbols had begun to emit a faint silver hue, soft like moonlight on bone. It shimmered beneath the mud as if the earth itself was remembering something through her skin. One of the elders stepped forward. His voice cracked. "Those markings? I've seen them. In the old scrolls. Before the wars. Before even the droughts." "No," Bwana snapped. "This is deception. She's cursed. This proves it." But the crowd had turned quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Nyasha raised her eyes, not defiant, not proud, but clear. She spoke only once. "I was never yours to shame." With that she turned toward the forest. No one stopped her. Not even Bwana, who stood frozen, lips trembling. The mud did not fall as she walked. It held, dry now, hardened into armor, into script. Her footsteps left no trace on the dusty earth, yet everyone felt the weight of her departure. She passed the last hut, where her mother stood watching, a single tear trailing down her cheek. Dahlia did not reach out. She only bowed deeply in the old way, forehead to hand to chest. Nyasha nodded once, then vanished into the green, the leaves parting around her as if they had been waiting. Behind her, the villagers stood in silence. No one cheered. No one moved. And somewhere in the distance, thunder cracked, not angry but warning. Bwana stood still long after the others left. He stared at the forest's edge where her body had disappeared, and for the first time he felt something cold crawl up his spine. He had meant to humiliate her. To break her. But now she carried something ancient, something he could no longer control. The mud had not shamed her. It had chosen her. And whatever came next would not be a trial. Would be a return. Nyasha walked with mud still clinging to her skin, now dried into something more than dirt, something closer to memory. The trees leaned in around her, vines brushed against her shoulders like curious fingers, and the shadows beneath the leaves moved with quiet intention. She did not know where her feet carried her, only that the air grew thicker, warmer, deeper. Each breath pulled her closer to something she could not name. The shame they had meant to place upon her no longer burned. Instead, her skin felt alive, as though the mud was no longer separate from her body, but a second layer, hard and ancient. It cracked gently at her joints when she moved, not from fragility but from purpose. Each step was an echo, each heartbeat a drumbeat answered by something under the soil. She did not weep. Not yet. By dusk, her legs had weakened. Hunger gnawed softly, but it was the weight of meaning, not the absence of food, that pulled her down. Near a massive tree whose roots curled like fingers over the earth, she fell to her knees. Then to her side. The forest grew quiet. And then stillness. Her breath slowed. The wind stopped. She drifted into sleep not as a girl who had been cast out, but as a vessel no longer held by her own story. Then came the voices. They did not speak with words. Not at first. They hummed low and steady, rising through the ground and into her spine, humming through her bones like song. There was no fear, only the overwhelming sense of being seen. Not as Nyasha the girl, not as the shamed, but as something ancient. She dreamed of rivers that glowed blue beneath the soil. Of women dressed in ash and starlight, dancing in silence around great stones. Of symbols etched into cave walls, pulsing like wounds still alive. One stepped forward, eyes covered in red dust, and placed her hand over Nyasha's heart. The mud cracked. She spoke, not aloud but through Nyasha's skull. "You carry the inheritance of the first mouth." The others behind her nodded, their faces lost to time. "You were not cursed. You were called." The ground trembled faintly. "These symbols on your flesh, they are older than speech. They were once worn by the priestesses of the threshold. We, the watchers of the earth's breath, marked the chosen with mud as you are marked now. Nyasha turned in the dreamscape, her voice caught between wonder and grief. Why now? Why me? The woman's voice softened. Because the silence has lasted too long. The air twisted, and suddenly she saw the village, Elora, trembling beneath brittle skies, its people locked in loops of fear. She saw Bwana's face, not cruel now but lost. She saw her mother's hands trembling over empty herbs. They have forgotten us. Forgotten balance. Forgotten truth. And yet they are still our children. Nyasha fell to her knees in the vision, overwhelmed. What must I do? Listen. The vision shifted. She stood in a great underground chamber, where roots glowed with soft green veins. The earth breathed. The air was thick with power, neither evil nor kind, just old. A wordless presence moved through her, filling her with heat, then ice, then stillness. She felt every ant crawling through soil miles away. She heard the heartbeat of a seed buried years before. She saw the sky not as blue but as language. The symbols on her skin pulsed in rhythm with it all. Then the voice whispered once more. When you wake you will not be alone. She gasped awake, sucking in air as if she had forgotten how. The tree above her was glowing faintly, no light, just a shimmer, as if memory itself clung to its bark. Her limbs felt heavy with meaning. She sat up slowly, her hands brushing against the dried mud on her arms. But it was no longer just mud. It had hardened into an intricate shell, smooth yet marked by fine ridges, runes, curves, and patterns like vines etched by 1,000 careful hands. It did not flake or fall away when she moved. It bent. It breathed. Nyasha's breath came out in mist, though the air was warm. She blinked and the forest sharpened. What had been green before was now layered, colors interwoven with emotion. She could feel the tree beside her humming. The ants that marched along its bark each sang a single note. The leaves whispered to one another and she understood them. She touched the base of her neck. It felt hot, alive. She could see trails in the dirt now, animal paths that had faded for any normal eye. The world no longer hid from her. It sang to her. She looked at her palms and saw the faint glow of the symbols. Older than language, the voice had said. She stood. The roots beneath her feet pulsed slightly as if recognizing her movement. The air held her name, not spoken, not shouted, but known. And then she began to walk, not aimlessly but with certainty, though she didn't yet know the destination. The forest no longer felt like wilderness. It felt like home. Like a great library without walls, where the pages were made of stone and wind and water. And she could read it. The calls of birds were no longer just sounds. Some sang of death. Some of rain. Some of places beyond mountains where the stars touched the ground. A fox stepped out from the underbrush, golden eyes staring into hers. It did not flee. It bowed its head and then vanished, silent as thought. Her hunger faded. Her body did not ache. She walked for hours and still the mud skin held, warm and strong. Occasionally, a word would rise unbidden in her mind. Names of trees she had never learned, memories that were not hers, songs from places she had never seen. They crowded her, yet did not drown her. She was no longer just Nyasha. She was becoming. She stopped at a small stream to drink. The water glowed faintly when it touched her lips. Her reflection looked older, not aged but rooted. Her eyes, once wide with wonder, now held something else. A knowing. A sadness. A fire. When she stood again, the forest shifted around her. Paths opened where there had been thorns. Stones moved subtly to guide her. Even the wind turned its head when she passed. She followed the pull until night came again. This time, when she lay beneath the stars, she did not sleep out of exhaustion. She lay down like one entering a sacred hall. And the voices returned, not chaotic, not overwhelming. One spoke clearly this time, as a mother might to a child ready for truth. You were not exiled. You were delivered. The stars blinked in rhythm. The earth pulsed below. In you lives memory. In you breathes balance. They broke what they feared. Now you carry what they need. She whispered aloud for the first time since waking, "What if I am not enough?" The wind answered with laughter, not cruel but patient. You are not meant to be enough. You are meant to open. And Nyasha understood. This was not about power. This was not about revenge. This was about remembering something the world had buried beneath shame and superstition. She was the voice between dirt and sky. The line between the broken past and the trembling future. She touched her chest again. The symbol there throbbed softly, like a sleeping heart. Somewhere in the village, a child cried in the night. Somewhere a leaf fell. Somewhere, a storm waited just out of sight. Nyasha's eyes closed. And for the first time the earth exhaled. The wind moved with meaning now, and Nyasha listened. The symbols etched into her mud skin itched not with discomfort, but with intention. They pulsed faintly under sunlight and glowed gently under moonlight, guiding her feet over moss and root, whispering directions into her blood. She did not question the path. It was as if something within her had always known the route, only waiting for the world to match its rhythm. Her first trial came in silence. She stepped into a grove surrounded by trees shaped like arches. The air was still, unnaturally so. In the center stood a lone tree, its bark dark and wet, its leaves trembling without wind. As she approached, the scent struck her, iron and earth. The trunk wept a thick red sap that ran like blood. It did not drip, it bled. She placed her palm against the trunk, and the bark responded with warmth like skin. A voice echoed from within the roots, "Feel it. Do not look away." The tree's sorrow surged through her body. She felt centuries of wounds, fields cleared for greed, rivers poisoned, animals hunted to vanishing. The pain of a world scarred by the very hands meant to live beside it. The tree wept for all of it. Nyasha's knees buckled. She pressed her forehead against the bark. "I see you," she whispered. "I'm sorry." The blood sap touched her cheek and didn't burn. It glowed briefly, then soaked into her skin. Another symbol bloomed over her ribs, twisting like a root seeking light. She stood without needing to be told. The tree was silent now, its blood slowing. A pain had been shared, and with it, a truth accepted. Her second trial came with smoke. As dusk fell, a thick mist rolled low over the forest floor, curling with purpose. It did not feel natural. From within it, something slithered, a sound not of scales but of breath. She turned and saw it. A serpent made of smoke. Its eyes were glowing embers, and its body rose and fell like a wave. It circled her without striking, whispering in tongues older than fear. "What will you do when they lie about you again? When the same hands reach to shame you? Will you strike? Will you run?" The serpent coiled closer, smoke brushing her skin. It hissed with temptation. "Revenge is power. You have earned it." Nyasha's fists clenched. But she did not move. Instead, she opened her palms, breathing slowly. "I am not here to burn," she said softly. "I am here to grow." The serpent paused. Its eyes dimmed. It unraveled in slow spirals, its smoke drawn into the earth like breath returning to the lungs. The ash it left behind formed a crescent on the ground. A symbol, now marked across her shoulder, burned briefly, then settled cold into her skin. Her final trial was the hardest. She found herself in a clearing with no exit. In the center stood a mirror taller than a man, made of stone and light. When she looked into it, she did not see her current form. She saw herself as an old woman. Wrinkled, tired, alone. Eyes dulled from too many losses. A crown of ash in her hair. She stepped back shaken. The reflection did not follow. Instead, it raised its hand and spoke in her voice. "This is who you become if you forget." Nyasha's breath caught. "Forget what?" she asked, her voice small. "That the earth speaks only to those who listen. That power must always serve balance. That pain, when stored too long, becomes rot." She reached toward the mirror. "But what if I'm not strong enough to carry it?" The reflection smiled. "Then you will ask the trees to carry it with you." The mirror dissolved into mist, and from it, a final symbol rose into the air before resting over her heart, shaped like a spiral sun wrapped in roots. She fell to her knees, not from pain but awe. The ground beneath her pulsed once, deeply. A final whisper came, not from the trees, not from the earth, but from within her blood. "You are earth blood, Nyasha. You carry the threshold between man and world. The first of your line in an age. The last, if forgotten." She stood slowly, eyes wet but firm. She understood now. She was no longer a girl shamed and cast out. She was the memory of balance made flesh. And her journey had only just begun. The wind that carried her back to the village was not the same wind that had once carried her cries. It came with weight, with memory, with murmurs in its currents. Nyasha emerged from the forest as the sun broke across the sky, her figure cloaked entirely in hardened mud, now flaked with golden dust. Her eyes glowed faintly, not with color, but with a deep inner light, as if fireflies lived behind her gaze. The air around her shifted. It thickened. Even the birds circled low above her head, crying out as though announcing her arrival to the soil itself. The villagers froze. They stood at the edge of the square, their eyes wide with awe and confusion. Mothers pulled their children close. Elders gripped their beads tighter. The market stalls, half set for trade, hung silent. The girl they had banished, the girl they had humiliated, had returned. But she did not speak. Not a word. Not a cry. Not a single name called out. She simply walked. Her feet, bare and caked in earth, stepped across the same dust where her shame had once been paraded. But now, with every step she took, something happened. Grass began to sprout. The dry, cracked ground softened beneath her touch. From the edges of her footprints, small green shoots pushed through, first tentative, then bold, uncurling toward the light. Whispers spread like fire across the village. She walks with the spirits. She is no longer one of us. No, she is more. Nyasha moved toward the center of the sacred ground, the very spot where she had once been accused and disgraced. The village's sacred fig tree stood nearby, half withered from months of drought. She paused before it. Then, slowly, deliberately, she knelt and pressed her palm to the soil. The ground responded with a tremor. It began as a low hum, barely noticeable. Then, suddenly, a deep, pulsing vibration spread from where her hand touched. The villagers gasped as the earth around her rippled gently, like water stirred by wind. From the soil sprang herbs, medicinal, rare, and strong-smelling. Flowers bloomed in colors unseen for years. Vines wrapped gently around the base of the sacred fig, and it began to flush with new leaves. Water seeped up from the cracks nearby, forming a shallow pool that shimmered with silver light. The air was changing. Birds, absent for months, returned in flocks, swooping low and perching fearlessly on the rooftops and trees. The scent of fertility, of growth, of rebirth hung heavy in the air. Still she said nothing. She did not have to. Then from the crowd, a mocking voice broke the silence. "Well, look who comes back thinking she's queen of the worms." It was Bwana. He stepped forward, arms crossed, his expression twisted with a smirk that barely hid his fear. "All this dirt and drama, what is it for? Tricks? Illusions? You've made flowers grow. So what? Any girl can spread seeds in the night." A nervous laugh rose from a few behind him. But most stood silent, watching. Nyasha looked at him, her face still unreadable. Then the symbols on her skin began to glow. Faint at first, then brighter, lines, curves, spirals, all etched into the dried mud covering her. They pulsed like fire breathed into stone. Then, slowly, gently they lifted. The symbols peeled themselves from her skin like smoke uncoiling from flame. They did not fall. They rose. Dozens of glowing glyphs floated above her, forming a ring of light that circled her head and shoulders, each one humming with ancient energy. They shimmered like stars held in orbit, whispering in a language no one remembered but all somehow understood. The earth under Bwana's feet cracked. He stumbled back. A tendril of vine wrapped around his ankle, not tight, not cruel, but firm. Like a hand that warned, not punished. Nyasha did not look at him again. Instead she turned her eyes to the people. Not in vengeance. Not in demand. Only in knowing. In silence she released the last symbol from her chest. It floated gently upward, then split into two streams, one flowing toward the earth, one toward the sky. Where they met, a soft bell-like sound rang through the air. The kind of sound that made even children still. Then she turned and walked toward the edge of the village. And the mud that once symbolized her shame shimmered in the light like sacred armor. The earth does not forget. In the weeks that followed Nyasha's silent return, the village began to crack, not just in spirit but in soil, in sky, in sleep. Nature, once a passive listener to man's foolishness, had turned judgmental. And its verdict began with the harvest. Crops that had shown promise, maize tall and green, cassava roots thick with promise, began to wither from the inside. First came a strange smell, a sourness that clung to the air. Then overnight the leaves browned, curled, and collapsed into the dust. What remained in the ground turned black, eaten by an invisible rot that no herb could cure. Cattle grew uneasy. They refused to graze near Bwana's land. His prized goat, once the strongest in the herd, walked into the river and drowned without struggle. Chickens laid cracked, hollow eggs, and bees abandoned their hives as if chased by smoke. Still the people said nothing aloud. But in their hearts they whispered the truth. The earth was listening. Then the ground began to move. Homes built over years began to lean, their walls softening as if the clay had lost its memory of shape. Entire huts sank slowly, terrifyingly into the softened earth. People would wake in the night to find their sleeping mats tilted, their doors jammed, their pots floating in thin pools of water that had never existed before. The dreams came next. Every night, those who had laughed during Nyasha's humiliation, Those who had thrown the mud, who had whispered curses into the crowd, woke screaming. They spoke of roots wrapping around their limbs, of mouths filling with soil, of being dragged underground by hands made of stone. Some stopped sleeping altogether. Some went mad. And Bwana? He grew quieter each day. The village man who once strutted like a peacock now walked with twitching shoulders, eyes darting to shadows. His own daughter, whom he had so fiercely protected from Nyasha's danger, began to speak to trees and wake with leaves in her hair. The girl would laugh at nothing and cry at everything. He beat her. The trees bled where he struck her. But the moment came when even silence could no longer shield them. It was near dusk, when the sun had dipped low and the village prepared for another restless night. Nyasha stood once more at the sacred ground. This time she spoke. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. You covered me in earth to shame me, she said, and the air grew still. But you did not know the earth listens. You did not know it remembers. The villagers gathered, drawn as if by an invisible pull. You feared my mother's ways. You feared the markings on my skin. You feared the strength of a girl who did not beg. You feared what you could not name, and so you chose to destroy it. She turned her eyes to the women. Many of them wept openly now. You mothers, sisters, you stood by and watched. You said nothing. You let your fear of the feminine divine bury your courage. You taught your daughters silence. Then she turned to Bwana. He had stepped forward, not out of courage, but out of the same pride that once made him raise his voice above others. You speak well, he said, but his voice trembled. But words do not change what is. The drought, the death, this madness, it's not justice. It's vengeance dressed in leaves. Nyasha stared at him long and hard. Then she lifted her arms slowly, and the mud that still clung to her body began to rise. It peeled upward, flakes first, then slabs, then entire sheets of hardened earth, floating midair like birds paused in flight. The air vibrated with power. The symbols, once etched in her skin, reappeared in the hovering mud, glowing dimly with ancient life. Your hands threw the first stone, she said, but it was your spirit that truly buried me. She brought her palms together. The floating mud whirled through the air, spun into a vortex of dust and memory, and then, with a force like thunder muffled in deep soil, it slammed into Bwana's chest. He gasped. The mud didn't just coat him, it consumed him. Wrapped him from feet to head in a shell of moving, living earth. It hardened over his legs, his arms, his mouth. He sank to his knees, imprisoned in a hunched, crumbling shell of shame. Only his eyes remained visible, and in them fear. Not of death, but of understanding. The villagers fell to their knees. Some prayed, some trembled, but all knew this was no spell, no trick. It was the soil delivering its judgment. It had seen what man had done to its daughter, and it had answered in kind. Nyasha lowered her hands. The earth is mother to us all, she said, but even a mother turns away when her children do not listen. She turned and walked once again into the sacred grove. Behind her the village stood still. And the wind, once silent, carried her words for miles. The morning after Bwana's imprisonment in the earth, a strange quiet settled over the village. The air felt heavier but somehow clearer, as if the earth itself had breathed a deep sigh and waited for something long overdue. Nyasha had disappeared into the sacred grove, leaving the villagers stunned, speechless, caught between awe and fear. But not all were silent. At the edge of the gathering crowd, the oldest women of the village, those with bent backs and silver hair like rivers of moonlight, slowly rose from their seats and stepped forward. Their eyes, clouded with age yet sharp as hawks, rested on the floating symbols still shimmering faintly in the air above the earth where Nyasha had stood. One among them, Mama Tandy, the village's eldest herbalist and keeper of stories, gasped softly and fell to her knees. Others followed. Their knees hit the hard ground, and they lowered their heads in deep reverence, whispering prayers in the old tongue, words long forgotten by younger generations. The crowd watched, hushed and curious. Mama Tandy's voice, fragile but steady, broke the silence. These signs, these are the marks of the earth blood keepers, those who walked before us, those who spoke to the soil and listened to the stones. She gestured to the symbols floating in the air, curves and dots, lines that twisted like vines, shapes that seemed to pulse with hidden life. Long ago, mud was not a mark of shame. It was the sacred veil of transformation. It was the embrace of the earth, the mother who carried secrets and power, she said. The villagers murmured among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others wide-eyed with wonder. Mama Tandy's voice grew stronger. Our ancestors did not cast out the marked. They celebrated them. They anointed them with mud not to shame, but to awaken the spirit within. She told of a time when the village had lived in harmony with nature's rhythms, when the earth blood keepers guided the people, interpreting signs from the land, healing the sick and protecting the balance between man and the wild. But as fear grew and the unknown became dangerous, those old ways were buried beneath distrust and silence. Fear blinded us, Mama Tandy said. And fear twisted our traditions until mud became a weapon, not a blessing. As the old women spoke, the younger villagers began to remember flickers of stories told by their grandparents, stories dismissed as myth or superstition. Some saw the truth in the symbols on Nyasha's skin. Others saw it in the trembling earth beneath their feet. Driven by newfound courage, a group of villagers followed Mama Tandy and the elders to the sacred grounds where Nyasha had touched the earth. The soil was soft and warm, alive with a pulsing energy. With careful hands, the elders began to clear away the dry leaves and broken branches. As they dug deeper, a hidden structure revealed itself, a temple long swallowed by earth and time. Its stones were carved with the same symbols that adorned Nyasha's skin and floated above the land. The carvings told stories of the earth blood keepers, their rituals, their communion with spirits, their protection of the delicate balance that had once made the village flourish. Images of women and men cloaked in mud, crowned with flowers and feathers, danced alongside symbols of the sun, the moon and the eternal cycles of life and death. Gasps rose from the crowd. The temple was more than a relic, it was a testament to a forgotten legacy. The mud was no longer shame. It was a promise. Nyasha's silence had spoken volumes. The village had been reborn through the memory of the ancients, their voices carried by the earth itself. And now, with the temple unearthed, the path forward was clear. The earth blood keepers would rise again. The dawn after the temple was uncovered, the village stirred with a new kind of energy, one born not from fear but from reverence. The stories whispered through the cracked walls of huts and danced on the morning breeze. Nyasha was no longer just a girl marked by mud and shame. She was the mud maiden, the living bridge between the old ways and the world reborn. That day, the village gathered beneath the ancient trees surrounding the sacred grounds. Nyasha stood before them, her skin still carrying the patterns of dried clay and mud, but now glowing softly with life. No longer a symbol of scorn, the mud had become her armor, her identity, her gift. The elders approached with offerings, not of gold or jewels but of earth itself, rich, dark clay scooped from the riverbed, twisting vines freshly cut from the forest, smooth, round stones polished by flowing water. Each element was carefully woven and placed upon her head and shoulders, creating a crown unlike any other. Vines curled gently around her hair, cradling small flowers that seemed to bloom with a whisper. The clay molded itself into intricate patterns along her forehead and cheeks, a living tapestry that connected her to the land beneath their feet. River stones, cool and ancient, settled like jewels among the vines, grounding her to the water that sustained the village. The crowd watched in silence, the air thick with awe and something unspoken, hope. Nyasha's eyes, once quiet and unsure, now shone with a calm power. She did not speak at first. Her presence alone spoke louder than words. From that day forward, the village transformed. Travelers from distant lands arrived, drawn by tales of the mud maiden who healed the earth and the soul. Some came seeking cures for ailments no healer had been able to mend. Others came searching for guidance on how to live in harmony with the land. Nyasha welcomed them all, not as a queen demanding homage but as a teacher offering wisdom. She showed the villagers and visitors alike how to listen to the soft murmurs of the soil, to hear the songs hidden in the rustling leaves, and to honor the sacred balance between man and nature. She spoke of the strength of women, the power that flowed through the earth and through their veins. She taught that true power was not dominance or vengeance, but renewal, the courage to rebuild what had been broken and to nurture what was fragile. Under her guidance, the village began to heal in ways they never imagined. Fields once barren flourished with vibrant crops. Streams long thought dry trickled again, their waters pure and clear. Birds returned to nest in the branches, their songs weaving through the air like blessings. The people too healed, old wounds of fear and shame replaced by pride and understanding. Nyasha's lessons were not confined to words. She led ceremonies where mud was used to anoint newborns, blessing them with protection and connection to the earth. She encouraged the planting of trees as living monuments to their ancestors and the future. The villagers learned to honor the women who had been silenced for generations, to recognize the sacred feminine not as a threat, but as a source of life and balance. The temple beneath the sacred grounds became a place of worship and learning. People gathered there to share stories, to meditate on the symbols carved into stone, and to celebrate the cycles of the earth. Nyasha's power was not that of magic for destruction, but of transformation, a reminder that even the deepest shame could be turned into strength, and that the earth beneath their feet held ancient wisdom waiting to be rediscovered. As seasons passed, the village thrived. It became a beacon for those lost in darkness, a sanctuary where the forgotten ways were remembered and revered. And at the heart of it all stood the Mud Maiden, crowned not with gold, but with the very elements of the earth she loved and protected. The village had changed beyond all recognition. What was once a place wrapped tightly in fear and superstition now breathed with life and quiet reverence. The earth beneath their feet pulsed with renewed energy, the ancient rhythms long buried beneath centuries of silence now awakening once more. Nyasha stood alone at the edge of the sacred grove in the soft light of dawn. Her skin, still marked with the mud and symbols of the earth blood keepers, felt warm to her touch. She raised her hand, palm facing upward, and for a moment, the air shimmered with an unseen power. From the depths of her palm, a new symbol emerged, a spiral of light, glowing softly as if spun from the very essence of the earth and the stars. It was a symbol older than the village, older than memory itself. The spiral turned slowly, a quiet dance of light and shadow. It pulsed gently, whispering secrets only those who truly listened could hear. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the glow faded, sinking back beneath her skin, leaving only the faintest trace of its presence. Nyasha smiled, a smile both peaceful and triumphant. This was the final mark, the seal of her journey, the sign that the balance had been restored. The earth's ancient covenant with her bloodline was renewed, the fragile harmony between mankind and nature carefully mended by her courage and the forgotten wisdom she carried. She thought back to the girl she had once been, quiet, misunderstood, and cast out by those who feared what they did not understand. The mud that had once been meant to shame her had become her armor and her legacy. What had started as pain and humiliation had transformed into a powerful symbol of renewal and hope. The villagers no longer saw her as a curse but as a blessing. The old fears that had twisted their hearts were replaced by awe and respect. The women who had long hidden their knowledge stepped forward to reclaim their roles as keepers of the ancient ways. The men who had doubted her now bowed their heads in humility, recognizing that the true strength of their community lay not in power or control but in unity with the earth. Nyasha felt the soft breeze brush her cheek, carrying with it the sense of blossoming flowers and freshly turned soil. It was as if the earth itself was breathing alongside her, steady and alive. The forest hummed with quiet life, and even the sun seemed to linger a little longer on the horizon, casting a golden light that felt like a blessing. She knew this moment was not an end but a beginning, a new chapter for her, the village, and the generations yet to come. The ancient knowledge, once buried beneath layers of fear and shame, would now grow and spread like the roots of the great trees that stood sentinel around the sacred grounds. The spiral on her palm was a reminder that life was cyclical, ever turning, and always connected. It was a promise that no matter how dark the night, the earth's heart would continue to beat, carrying the wisdom of the ancients to those willing to listen. In the quiet that followed, Nyasha closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer to the earth, a prayer of gratitude for the trials she had endured, the strength she had found, and the path that had led her back home. The village, too, settled into a gentle peace. Children played in the fields once again, their laughter mingling with the songs of birds. The rivers flowed clear and strong, nourishing the land and all who depended on it. And the people, united by the Mud Maiden's journey, carried forward the sacred teachings with reverence and care. Though the earth was quiet, it was never truly asleep. Beneath the surface, the ancient power pulsed steadily, a living force that would protect, guide, and nurture for all time. Nyasha's story became legend, a tale told around fires and whispered in sacred groves, inspiring those who felt lost or cast aside to find strength in their roots and hope in the cycles of renewal. And so, as the sun rose high and the village flourished, the Mud Maiden stood tall, a living symbol of balance restored and the enduring power of the earth's forgotten ways. Her journey complete, the earth and its children were safe once more.